Right. Welcome, folks, for our new Hangar DX podcast episode, where we talk about everything related to developer experience. And today with us, we have Cathy. Cathy coming from Confluent, and we will be talking about the challenges of developer productivity, especially as organizations scale. Before that, Cathy, please introduce yourself and we'll get rolling.
So I'm Cathy Nunez, and I hate to admit that I have 3 decades of experience in the computer industry, working all the way from firmware all the way up the tech stack to user interfaces, a little bit of dabbling in the consulting, which I didn't enjoy as much as the tech. And I've been at Confluent for 3.5 years. So when I came in, we had about 150 engineers, and we're inching up towards 1,000 now. So I've seen us scale and grow. We were a private company, now we're public. So it's been a good journey.
That's amazing. And can you describe what particularly do you manage at Confluent?
I focus on developer productivity. So
Perfect.
It's my main mission, make our developers easy and great. And I say the best part of my job is my customers are the engineers, and the worst part of my job is my customers are the engineers.
Nice. That's amazing. So maybe we can start with just you describing what does developer productivity even mean, and especially from the context of scaling. And you've already seen sort of your Confluent as an organization and as engineering scale.
Right.
So what do you seen kind of the core challenges with it?
Well, so, I mean, first, developer productivity means different things to different people. In my mind, I do serve the engineers, and it is to remove the friction in their jobs and what they're trying to do. We want them to be able to be innovative and creative and as efficient as possible. But I don't do that by measuring and telling them how to move quicker. It is more, how do I enable them and provide them the tools so that they can be their best? So that means different things to a front-end engineer than it does a back-end engineer. And so understanding those nuances is important. And as you come in an organization, typically when we had 100 and something engineers, they all brought their own tools and did their own thing. Very efficient. So from a productivity perspective, they loved it. But from growing a business and being able to hit those enterprise ready and scale and go from, 100 to 200 to 300 to 500, a lot of those tools were open source and free, and then they became cost prohibitive as we started to scale. And as you're trying to get synergies and make improvements or implement a security feature, having 6 different CI systems makes it overly complicated. And so being able to balance that transition of growth without taking things away from the engineers is important.
Interesting. So in a way, it sounds like what you're describing is as your organizations grow, standardization becomes more important?
In some ways, yes. And then in some ways, you have a little bit more customization because teams tend to, become customized in what they're focused on. So
Right.
We have a UI team. They used to be UI developers spread across all the teams, and now they're focused. And so with that focus, they do have a unique synergy, and their tooling and needs are slightly different. So being able to optimize for them, but not sub-optimize the organization as a whole. So it's a bit of a give and take. It's like trying to balance a seesaw.
That's interesting. So, that's also a challenge in large organizations where there's multiple different departments and also multiple different stacks.
Yeah.
How do you manage, especially if you're running the DevX charter at Confluent? How do you kind of manage that, especially if there are multiple different teams that have to be supported? Is it they're embedded smaller teams within those departments, or are you sort of a central team?
We are a central team at the moment.
Okay.
We came from embedded smaller teams, which is probably why we're now centralized, because what we found was those smaller teams were, optimizing for each individual team. But as a company as a whole, it was suboptimal. And then when you had integrations and teams had to come together, you didn't have that level of consistency. So we do have a team, which is kind of like an engineering IT team, which focuses on the predominant tools, our CI systems, our build systems. And they focus on a consistency across the organization. So that's a consolidation. But then we have another team that focuses on our application development toolkit, which is usually customized and in partnership with different engineering teams.
Interesting. So how do you measure productivity? Like, I understand, like, you're not probably, like, as you said, you don't like measure a lot, but like there should still be like some context of like understanding measuring productivity, and also kind of like how does that change over time, like especially as you've seen kind of like organization grow.
Yeah, so we did start trying to get kind of an industry benchmark of where we're at. So we started with the Dora benchmark. And at Composite, it was useful because we could see where the hot points were. But at the team level, it wasn't efficient in letting you know, hey, where are your pain points and where are you at? So now we kind of have a mix of, we provide information to the developer managers on what they need to do and understand. But you have to be very cautious that it doesn't become hey, Johnny did 10 CRs and approvals, and Sally only did 3, and you're like, yeah, those 3 were much more impactful and much more complex than the 10 one-liners that Johnny did. So it's also educating in how you have your process and your tooling.
Interesting. Can you give an example of kind of like what kind of feedback you could give to improve a particular team?
Well, one example that we're working on now is our development teams tend to have a lot of flaky tests, which of course slows down their CI system. And also, you will often hear I don't trust the results, so I can't do it a fully automated deployment.
Right.
I have to stop, I have to review. And if you really want to be efficient, you want all of that stack automated. So it's working with them of, well, why is it flaky and why is it not important for you to fix those? I mean, yes, there will always be some tests, but, consistent flakiness is something that should be addressed.
I mean, consistent flakiness is also oxymoron, but yes.
I know. But if you have a test that fails, 3 out of 5 times every week, that's something you should look at and resolve.
Right. And this also kind of like in some ways goes back into like trust, right? Like you are trying to build trust in the test systems, which is hard to do if there is flakiness.
Yes. And the other thing we've been focusing on is shifting left. So, rather than everybody doing end-to-end test, leveraging local component and contract testing so that even before it gets into the system test realm, they know it's going to work. Interesting.
How do you encourage that?
We start by talking to the value, and then we get some teams that are doing it well. And we show the impact it has on their end-to-end ability to deliver. Versus a team that may be struggling and has all manual tests that they developed for their new feature.
I see. So it's probably also related maybe to test infrastructure itself, like whether it's possible to run it.
Yeah.
Local setup.
It's interesting because a lot of teams will say, "Oh, I can't automate this," or "I can't shift left." And when you actually get in and have the conversations with them, 9 times out of 10 we can find a way to shift it left. Maybe not all the way to the local ID, but maybe at the contract level.
That's amazing. So switching gear a little bit, I mean, also still in metrics, you did mention like, it's hard to, or like, it's bad to measure, right, how people are like doing, for instance, like individuals as like a code review.
Without the context, yes.
Without the context. So do you have any thoughts on kind of like, especially when it comes to productivity metrics, like how do we create frameworks or mental model to encourage sort of like understanding team productivity versus individual productivity? And is there like a space for individual productivity metrics?
There is a place, but I do believe it is at the manager level and at the manager's discretion, because every team is a little different. When I came in and we started hiring a whole bunch of junior engineers, where they were a year ago, we were covering the basics with them. And now they've been here a couple of years. And so, the way we measure and encourage and get them to the next level is different than when you're just starting out and saying, here's how you write production code for an enterprise system.
Nice.
So that context is important. And you really want to equip your managers, and you want them to understand the nuances and the differences. And, we had rapid growth. So we got managers from all over the industry, and they all have their own perspective. And getting that consistency and that calibration across the team is also important.
Very interesting. Is there like a framework that you follow to kind of like get that consistency?
We are working on a framework. So we could follow and have that consistency. This was the first year we actually shared with all the managers their metrics so they could see it.
Got it. Interesting. All right. So, okay, moving on to kind of like, the core of the DevX, right? In the some ways, like we were talking about how this is people, processes, and tools.
Yes.
So let's kind of like even start with tools, like especially with the whole hot AI these days going on. But like even with or without the hype of AI, what do
Yeah.
you think are kind of like some of the tools that really make a difference when you think about like developer productivity?
Yeah. So if you look at the software development lifecycle, engineers spend about a third of their time probably in their IDE. So having a good IDE tool set and the ability to leverage things, whether you're using a workspace or you have a really high powered Mac, giving them the tools to be productive when they're in that and they can have flow is important. And then as you walk through the stack as they go into integrate, making sure they have an environment that's reliable and stable and they can trust the results from it is the next piece. And then at the company level, making sure that the tools you're using for your CI system and your deployments, and you have the ability to scale beyond, just a basic commercial. You can go multi-cloud, you can go federal, you can be SOX compliant, that it has all those foundations that allow you to do that. So, in every discussion, buy versus build, you have to be thinking broader than your initial need.
Interesting. So how do you make a decision of buy versus build?
So some of it is it a core competency that we want to build and it's going to be value add to Confluent? A CI system in my mind is a commodity. It should be consistent. We did the evaluation. We had 5 or 6 when I came in. We first evaluated what was the use case for all of them and do we need 6? We determined we didn't. And then we determined, all right, now we know, looking out at our strategic roadmap of where we want to be and some of the things we want to accomplish, we had some significant, guidelines to hit that enterprise space and to be FedRAMP compliant that we knew we were going to need to meet. So then we started the evaluation of that. So it was very quickly, we can consolidate, we can have an enterprise. It's going to have to be on-prem and managed by us to hit those security constraints, so we can move it into a FedRAMP high environment at some point in the future. So once we hit all of those markers, the team was upset, but they also understood, building this out would take years and it's not a core competency.
Interesting. So you were using a CI in-house build previously?
There was a portion of a team that had somewhat of a in-house build. There was a whole lot of Jenkins. We had Semaphore, we had Circle CI, we had some Azure, so.
Interesting. I feel like the only company I've heard of like building their own CI is probably MongoDB. They have like built their own CI system.
Yeah. But it's also interesting because if you scale up enough, a lot of the tools that you get from vendors become cost prohibitive, and then you end up building your own just because.
Right. And I believe like customization is also a big part of it, right? Like how custom a solution you want, and like whether you kind of like get locked in with the vendor, but you cannot customize enough.
Exactly. And then, making sure you have a vendor you can trust.
Right.
It doesn't matter how good their stuff is, but if they aren't there when you have a problem, that's an issue. So,
right. Yeah. Interesting. When we were talking about like tooling, I think the other part, hold on. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, maybe we'll move on. I think I kind of like lost what I was talking about.
If you come back to it, let me know.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to talk about IDPs?
Sure. I honestly believe most teams will end up with an IDP. At Confluent, we started the journey for one, and we've kind of stalled out on it. And it wasn't that the IDP wasn't there and it's not useful and we don't think there's value. It was our data wasn't in the state that was ready to support that. So we didn't have the consistency of the data, the correctness. Teams didn't have consistent patterns. Even our Jira was different. I love your thumbs down.
It's happening automatically. Yeah. I'll clip it out. It's all right.
No. I actually think it's pretty good. But if you look at it from a developer perspective, knowing where all your work is, where it is in the state, being able to see that timeline across the software development lifecycle, all of that makes sense. Having tools that can connect and make that easier, kind of like Backstage allows you to pull in plugins and the like, all of that logically makes sense. But the team culturally has to be ready for it. and you have to have that foundation. So I think we'll be there. We just didn't have the foundation in place.
Okay. Do you think there are other tools that you use in place of an IDP today which serve the purpose?
Yes, but they're mostly homegrown. There are separate reporting features using everybody's favorite tool. And so, and so then you have what I'd view as ultimately it will be wasted effort because everybody's doing their own thing, or we're consolidating on, the tool that the person that's running it knows. And then in the long run, it won't be sustainable.
I see. Interesting.
But this is also knowing where you are in the journey and knowing which battles you can fight and which windmills should wait till a future.
Interesting. All right, let's move on to a little bit of processes. I think this is like definitely one of my favorite areas to talk about. Like, there's obviously like tools and those evolve over time as well. But there is also like processes and practices, which I think are to some degree like evergreen, or at least they're like the mental models of how you think about like operating.
Yeah.
Do you have like any general thoughts? Like I can obviously like I would want to talk on specifically like some other specific processes, but like do you have any philosophy around like how you think about like engineering processes internally at Confluent?
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you Cathy's personal.
Yeah, let's do it.
And then we're going to talk a little bit about at Confluent and how the pendulum can swing a little too far at times. So I believe any process we have should enhance your product delivery. And so it should be a guardrail that prevents you from doing something that would do harm to our customers or ourselves. It should be, something that will allow you to be more efficient and effective. And, you get that consistent quality that you want in the outcome. So, I am a big fan of processes live for a season and probably live and die. They don't last forever. So we've always done it this way is something that really bothers me. But, I also understand the need for the process. At Confluent, we didn't have a lot of processes. We had a lot of, independence and autonomy. And at the developer level, as we scaled, you have to have a process. So you have those guardrails. I think, we had a lot of people that came from big companies and they gave us big company processes, which is great when you have large teams that can handle it. But I really think, in the last 12 to 18 months, we probably overcorrected and had more process than we needed for what we were trying to do. And so, you get the blowback from the developers of, oh my gosh, this, monthly security CVE update is taking a lot. Now, thankfully, as an organization and as a team, we listen to the feedback and we are right sizing and correcting and improving and automating. But I think we could have done a lot of that up front instead of doing the process, making it too heavy and then having to backtrack.
Interesting. Can you give an example? Like, I really like the point you brought up, like, having a lifetime or sort of like, that process shouldn't live forever. Do you have an example of like where this could be applicable?
Yeah. I mean, we just got a new people business partner that, came in and started a BS reduction. And in the first month, we had 100 BS reduction items come up.
I'm sorry, what is BS?
Getting rid of the BS in the organization,
the
things that aren't efficient that make it harder for you to do your job.
I see. I thought this was like some internal term.
Nope. But if you look at that and go, hey, if we get 100 items just from somebody saying, what's your sticking point? And some of them were really valid, so I think that is a classic example of being able to come in and go, what's working and what's not? What do we need to stop, continue, and keep?
Interesting. Okay. So kind of like maybe on the same lines, I would want to talk about like tech debt. I think this is also something which is, evergreen. Like even in the AI world, I feel like maybe we are incurring more tech debt than alleviating. But like, I'm also curious, like how you think about like tech debt in the context of productivity, and especially like, this is a conversation, especially at leadership level, it comes up very commonly, which is like, do we prioritize like product development? Do we prioritize tech debt improvements? Like, how do you handle that for your organization?
Yeah, so every organization is going to be a little different depending on where they are in the maturity curve and what they're trying to achieve. I will generally say a good rule of thumb is every organization needs to focus on their tech debt because it will come back to bite you. A lot of people can kick the can down the road for a period of time. But if you don't have an ongoing effort and focus, and it's always on the next new shiny, you'll have a lot of new shiny with a lot of rough edges. And so that will force you to have to come back and fix that because your customers are going to tell you. So from that perspective, making sure that you do it. I had a discussion with an engineering manager that's like, I've got a tight schedule. I don't have time to do this. And they didn't enable some tooling that we have that would allow them to future-proof. We'd add it in one place and they would take advantage of it. And so now every time they're having to go through, they're having to add it themselves because they're unique and they're an offshoot. So it's those little things that can, be 1,000 paper cuts that make you bleed to death.
Interesting. Do you have like any framework or thought process around like how to even understand tech debt, or like more importantly, like, tech debt generally is considered that it's inevitable. Like every organization will have it. Like as soon as you write code, like, things become deprecated, right? Or things become like TED. How do we think about like, what is a more critical part of tech debt, and like how do we kind of like pick the most important, impactful pieces?
Yeah. So we have a simplistic view of looking at return on investment, for everything that we do. And so even on tech debt, we will look at, okay, is everybody going to have to keep up with these? Is there something we can do that could consolidate, automate, do it once for everyone? Or is it unique enough that everybody has to be able to handle it? And within the teams, we generally try to reserve between 25 and 30% that they can focus on either tech debt or some innovative concept that may not yield any results, but they just want to try it. So we kind of focus in on that to give independence at the team level, because that's typically where they know the tech debt is giving them the most pain.
Right.
And then at the organizational level, making sure we reserve that time for them. And then looking across teams at the pain points of, hey, everybody's having an issue with keeping up with the monthly CVE updates. How do we do that better?
I see. So just to summarize, you're saying is like there's multiple initiatives happening. One is at like an organization level, sort of like maybe at your level. And then there's like a multi-team level, which is like maybe some sort of a library or framework, which would require improving so that like everyone can benefit. And then like each individual team also have sort of like their own initiatives, which they can prioritize depending on kind of like how impactful it is for them.
Yes.
Interesting. Do you facilitate some of these things, especially kind of like, at like each individual team level, or sort of like, at least at the top level?
At the top level, yes. And often I end up getting involved after it's problematic. And then I, get pulled into to fix the pain point that has evolved. But one of the initiatives that we're talking about within developer productivity is how do we build in some of these add-on tools that we've had to create into the architecture itself. So looking at, in our platform, how do we build it in that we have an internal use case that's just as important as our external customer use cases.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So switching gear a little bit, let's talk a little bit also about like process overload. Like this is a thing which happens, especially in large organizations. I think you kind of like already touched a little bit on it, right? Like people bringing in processes from like larger companies, which you may not have like enough team and resources to support.
Right.
How do you think about like process overload? And like also maybe for the listeners, what could be a good mental model to think about where it feels like, oh, we might be actually doing too many processes?
Yeah. So the classic example is when your managers are saying, I spend more time giving status than I do doing. That's a problem. And typically, status and process grows first. So because it's the easiest to solve some of the problems and get the visibility. So I also think for every engineering leader, having at the end of the year or every quarter, what's working, what's not, what should we keep, what should we get rid of? Having those conversations and having those conversations in a very frank manner is important. And that's one of the things I like about Confluent. At the beginning, I said I love and hate my engineers at the same time. They are very vocal, but I appreciate that because they're going to tell us when we miss the mark, whether it be on our promotion, cycle and the fact that their promotion package takes too long, or whether it be, on, a migration that they're having to do, or that we've stacked migrations and they've got, 5 new processes that they're trying to roll out to meet everybody's needs and they're all due on the same date, and independently they all look good, but when you combine them, it puts a lot of weight on an individual engineering team who's also trying to deliver a product.
That's very interesting. How do developers typically provide this kind of feedback, or how does it get bubbled up? Like, do you folks do surveys?
We do have engagement surveys twice a year, and that gives a lot of feedback. We also have developer productivity ambassadors, so we have someone on each team, and we meet on a monthly basis, and they give us that. Like I said, we have a pain point, so anybody can open a developer pain point, and it'll come through and be reviewed by us. We have the corporate-wide VS initiative that anybody can complain about anything that will get recognized and take action. So we have multiple venues where people feel comfortable, implementing and sharing.
Awesome. All right, I know we are coming close to time, so I want to cover like one of the core parts also, the third part of the entire DevX, which is culture and people. So more specifically, like, in a organization which is 10%, 100% will be very different than an organization which is like 1,000%.
Yes.
So how does like scaling impacts team structure, like ownership, collaboration, overall kind of like the whole like culture and people side of things?
Yeah. So I really think it's important to have the core values that aligns a company around it. You can look at every great company that's been able to scale successfully, and they have some core values that you see embodied in everyone. And I think that's been very helpful for Confluent as we, started to scale. And as we hit a significant point, actually introducing some leadership principles that the team could understand and we could have that consistency at the leadership level was also important. So I think those are the 2 linchpins, but none of it matters if it's a poster on the wall. It actually has to be part of, the everyday, in the vernacular, in what you do. Encouraging people to call out when we aren't living up to that culture. And you also have to recognize, where is the team? If I wanted to introduce AI 2 years ago, it probably wouldn't have gotten the adoption and the focus that it is now. But it's also important that I have proof points and I have data and I can back it up so that they can test me and, and make sure that from a cultural perspective, we're doing the right thing for the people at the right time.
That's very interesting. So how has remote work impacted that?
The key to remote work is to be remote but not distant. So you still have to have those opportunities where you can come together as a team. We do offsites. That time is invaluable in, getting to know each other. A lot of teams do a social hour. So the time you wouldn't get in bumping into somebody in the hallway, over coffee, you can still have those moments. The start of our meetings tend to have a little bit of that. But I will say Confluent's my first remote company, predominantly remote, yet it is the company where I feel the closest to the people that I work with. And some of it is our values. And smart, humble, and empathetic is something that is one of our core values. And that empathy makes a huge difference.
That's amazing.
They care about me as a person as well as a technologist, which is vital.
Right. I think that's kind of something which many organizations miss, especially in remote work, is like it feels very transactional. You don't build kind of like the same empathy for others.
Yeah. And as you scale, it's really easy to become a number and not a person. And I do think that's one thing that Confluent has done well. And I attribute Jay to really having that as who he is. Even though he's leading a large organization now, he's still just as approachable and honest and transparent as he probably was when it was 150 people.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Very cool. And kind of like, also related to people is overall like people understanding how well they're doing. And like, I think that's also like the product. Like, I understand it's like the other side of productivity, which is like individual productivity versus team. But do you have any thoughts on kind of like how, especially as like teams scale, like organizations scale, how do you kind of like become more than just a number? Like, how do you kind of like really understand how you're performing yourself individually?
Yeah. Well, one of the things we leverage is the quarterly check-in. And we're now changing it more to like a monthly format where you're having those conversations with your manager on an ongoing monthly basis. One of the things that organizationally, giving constructive feedback, even growth feedback in a promotion, is still hard for some people.
Right.
So that is an area that we're working to improve, so that not only are you giving really good candid feedback in a code review, but you're also giving it to the individual of, this will take you from good to great. And, here's one thing you can do to make yourself better. And I think that is the secret sauce that helps a team go, from where they are today to being able to beat the competition in the future.
Very cool. Anything else you want to share about like people practices?
Well, for everyone, we all have to continue growing. So recognizing the fact that if you stay stagnant, you're falling behind, especially in this industry. If I stayed where I was 3 decades ago, I think I'd still be programming in C. So I think that's the exciting part, but it's also the challenging part, is you have to keep learning and growing in whatever your passion in your area is.
Right. And we're also living in interesting times. I think things are changing very rapidly.
It's a transformation, but it's also very careful to ride the wave and not the hype. Because you can look back in history at server versus client.
Right.
All the architecture that was going to take over.
So with that, like maybe you can share what you feel about the future of developer productivity, in the sense like, where things are going, what are like, what's the hype, what's the reality, and how are you feeling about like, the next few years in developer productivity?
Yeah. So I am convinced that AI will transform the way developers work. And I look at the copilots that are out there right now and, take advantage of the gift. It's like having your own intern. You still have to check their work, but it's going to certainly, make things easier for you, and some mundane tasks come off the plate. I think where there's a lot of hype is, its ability to troubleshoot and diagnose complex problems. Yeah, you can do that, but the uplift and the effort you have to do it right now probably isn't worthwhile to roll it out to an entire organization and say, hey, our pre-production environment is going to be monitored by AI. And in order to have any of this be successful, you have to have a very solid foundation. So if you have, cracks in the foundation that you're trying to fix, AI is not going to resolve that. You still have to do the heavy lifting to get a firm foundation with good data.
Interesting. What would you recommend, like kind of like folks who are listening, maybe sort of like, things that you have learned from your experience, especially managing developer productivity at a large organization, right? Like, what are some of the key things that they can do in the next few weeks or months that will help them become better leaders for their productivity?
Yeah. So if you're just starting out, developer productivity should be built into your foundation. It shouldn't be a bolt-on or add-on afterwards. So having those initial metrics, if you want to know how you're doing, you should know, well, how often do we deploy? How many issues do we have going out to the field that we have to roll back and revert? So in getting those basic metrics, even if you're not sharing them with everybody, but having them in place, as you grow and scale, they will be beneficial versus trying to retrofit them. We talked at the start about code owners and keeping, the source of truth and the data updated. Yeah, have some really good hygiene, both in, even your JIRAs. I can tell you how many JIRAs I see that are 5 years old and have one sentence in them. Is that tech debt? Maybe.
I mean, at the end of the day, yes, like tech debt is inevitable. And I think there are like certain tools and processes that people can follow to actually like work around and like make things better. Yeah. But yes, like at the end of the day, I think a lot of developer productivity challenges are actually people challenges.
Yes. Yeah, don't look at culture as gravy, because it is the thing that will make or break a good company.
Very cool. All right, Cathy, I think we are at time. Do you want to kind of like cover anything else, or should we wrap up?
No, I think it's good. The one thing I would say is have a community, and Hangar's been great that way. Being able to know what everybody else is doing, because developer productivity spans every industry. So being
Right.
able to touch base with that cross section will help you as a leader make sure you're not missing something that's important. So thank you for what you do.
Awesome. Amazing, Cathy. This was lovely talking to you. Learned so much about like how developer productivity works at scale, or how we think about how challenges are much harder at as organizations grow, which is
Yeah,
kind of like also both the fun and the
it is.
uh, you know
Yeah,
the challenge to grow this.
yeah,
But
yeah.
absolutely. I think thinking about foundations, thinking about structure is important, and all of those things are
It is, but you don't want to lose speed.
right.
You got to keep that iterative. So know which teams you have to run a little slower because you'll take the whole business down, and which teams you can say run as fast as you can and try new things. So
Awesome.
yeah,
All right, Cathy. Thank you so much for your time. And
thank
it
you.
was a pleasure speaking with you. And I'll see you at other Hangar DX sessions.
I hope so. Thanks.
All right. Have a good
Bye.
one. Bye bye.